The auction nobody watched. The market was loud, full of voices shouting prices. Cages stood in a long line, each one holding someone for sale. Strong alien fighters, pretty dancers, skilled cooks. Buyers walked up and down, placing bids, laughing, and pointing. But in the farthest corner there was one small cage that nobody looked at. Inside it sat a thin alien girl with dirty skin, bruised arms, and dull purple eyes. Her body was covered in scars. Her hair was rough and cut unevenly like someone had chopped it with a knife. She wore no shoes, only a torn cloth wrapped around her like an old sack. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She didn't even look up. The seller didn't bother shouting her price. He just placed a sign on her cage. Defective slave. Wounded, worthless. 1 coin or less. No one stopped. She's ugly. She's probably sick. Who would want that? The crowd passed by, uninterested. Children laughed and threw stones. A trader kicked her cage, and still she didn't move. Then a human man appeared. He was not dressed like the rich buyers. His clothes were simple, dusty boots, a brown jacket, and a scarf around his neck. He had no guards, no servants, just a small bag on his back. He walked slowly, looking at each cage. When he reached hers, he stopped. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, really looked. She finally lifted her head, expecting him to spit or mock her. But he didn't. His eyes were calm. Tired maybe, but kind. The seller noticed and came closer, grinning. "That one?" he asked, laughing. "She's trash. You sure? 1 coin is more than she's worth." The human man reached into his pocket and pulled out a single credit coin. He handed it over, without a word. "Suit yourself," the seller chuckled. "No refunds if she dies on the way home." The cage door creaked open. For a moment, the girl didn't move. "Go," the seller barked. "You belong to him now." Slowly, she crawled out. Her legs were weak. She nearly fell. The human reached out but didn't touch her. He simply turned and started walking. She followed, barefoot. People stared. Some laughed. "A human with a broken toy," someone whispered. But the human didn't care. The walk back to his home was long and silent. The girl didn't ask questions. She just followed like a shadow. The sun was low by the time they reached a small house near the forest edge. It was quiet. No noise. No other people. He opened the door and stepped aside. She looked at him confused. She thought maybe he wanted her to stay outside. But he nodded toward the warm light inside. She walked in. There was a soft couch, a low table, and a fire burning gently. A small pot was cooking something that smelled good. Her stomach growled, loud and painful. He noticed but said nothing. He pointed to a wooden bench by the fire. She sat slowly, not knowing if it was a trick. Then he brought a bowl of soup. He placed it in front of her and stepped back. She stared at it, then at him. "Eat," he said softly. She grabbed the bowl with shaking hands and brought it to her lips. It burned her tongue, but she didn't stop. She drank it all in one go, as if afraid it might disappear. He gave her water, then a blanket, then walked to the other side of the room and sat quietly, reading something. She curled into the corner, her body warm for the first time in many days. Her hands still shook, but not from cold. This time from confusion. Why wasn't he hurting her? Why did he feed her? What did he want? That night she didn't sleep. She kept waiting for him to come over and do what every other master did. But he never moved. He let her sleep on the soft rug near the fire. He didn't chain her. He didn't even lock the door. In her mind, she tried to understand, was this a trap? Was he playing a game? Why? But the next morning, the only thing he said was, "There's food on the table." And then he walked out to the field behind the house to work. She stood by the window, watching him. This human was strange. Quiet. Kind. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. But he also didn't hit. No one had ever looked at her the way he did at the auction. Not with disgust, not with pity, but with something else. Something she didn't have a name for yet. The alien girl woke up slowly, her body still tense. Her eyes opened to the soft crackling sound of firewood. The warmth was real. She wasn't outside. She wasn't locked in a cage. For a moment, she wondered if she was dreaming. But then her stomach growled again. The memory of the soup came back, the taste, the heat, the way he had handed it to her without saying anything cruel. She looked around. The human was not there. The door was closed, but not locked. A small folded blanket was near her side, and on the table across the room fresh bread and fruit waited. She didn't touch it at first. Her mind was full of questions. Why? Why was she here? Why wasn't she beaten? Why hadn't he used her like the others had? No master ever gave her food without pain. No one ever let her sleep near a warm fire. She didn't trust it, couldn't trust it. This had to be some kind of trick. Maybe he was playing with her, kindness first, then cruelty later. Still, her body was weak. Her belly ached. Her hands shook. She stood up slowly and walked barefoot to the table. She picked up a piece of bread. It was soft, warm. She bit into it and ate slowly, watching the door the entire time. The fruit followed. Then a glass of clean water. No one came in. No punishment. Just silence and comfort. It confused her more than pain ever had. Later, the door opened. The human stepped inside with dirt on his boots and sweat on his neck. He saw her standing, eyes wide, half a piece of bread in her hand. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He just nodded and placed a basket of vegetables on the counter. Then, to her shock, he walked past her like she was anyone, like she was not a slave. He lit the stove, washed his hands, and began preparing food. She stared, waiting for orders, expecting him to snap or command her to kneel. Nothing came. Instead, he looked at her and said calmly, "You can sit if you want." She sat. He cooked in silence. The smell of cooked vegetables and spices filled the room. The fire crackled. Her hands were still curled in her lap, her back straight, ready to run or defend herself. But she didn't have to. He placed a full plate in front of her, and one in front of himself. Then he sat across from her and began eating. She watched his every move. Not because she was curious, but because she didn't know how to act like this. "Do you have a name?" he asked. She froze. A name? Nobody had ever asked that before. She'd been called thing, animal, or it for so long that she had forgotten her real name. Her lips moved, but no sound came. He noticed her fear and didn't push. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to speak. Not yet." They ate in silence. But this silence wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It felt strange. Safe. She was waiting for something to go wrong, for his kindness to suddenly snap. But the moment never came. Over the next few days, she noticed small things. He didn't ask her to clean. Didn't tell her to serve. He just let her be. He worked outside during the day, and at night he made food for them both. When he saw her shivering one evening, he placed a clean shirt and pants folded on her blanket. They were too big for her, but they were soft. She wore them carefully and held on to them like treasure. She still didn't speak. But she watched him more closely now. He was quiet, but never angry. He read books, chopped firewood, and repaired broken things. Once, she watched him fix a cracked music box. When it finally played again, soft and broken, she felt something inside her stir, a forgotten feeling. One morning she tried to help. She took a broom and started sweeping the floor. When he saw her, he didn't shout or stop her. He simply said, "Thank you." That made her chest feel strange, tight. No one had ever thanked her. Later that night, he left a small cup of warm tea beside her blanket and said, "You don't owe me anything." She didn't understand. Of course she owed him. He bought her. He owned her. But still, he never treated her like a slave. Each day she started to move more freely. She looked out the window. She swept the floor again. She folded the blanket he gave her. She watched his hands as he fixed broken tools and wondered how hands like those could be so gentle. Not once did they strike her. Not once did he raise his voice. And slowly something even more dangerous began to grow inside her. Hope. She still had scars. She still walked with her head low. But now, for the first time in her life, she was starting to believe maybe, just maybe. She wasn't worthless. She didn't know how to say it. So one night she did the only thing she could. She whispered softly when he walked past her, the first word she had spoken in years. "Thank you." The girl woke up before the sun, as she had done every morning since arriving in the human's home. The fire had gone out during the night, and the room was cold, but her body was wrapped in the oversized blanket he'd given her. She held it, tightly, burying her face into the soft cloth. It still smelled faintly of herbs and firewood. That smell made her feel safe. She didn't understand why. Safety was a new feeling. Alien. Unfamiliar. It made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with hunger or pain. The human was outside again, working before dawn, chopping wood and checking the fields. She heard the dull thuds of his axe striking the logs, steady and strong. She watched him for a while through the window. He worked without looking back. He never locked the door. Never once warned her not to run, as if he knew she wouldn't. And she wouldn't. She didn't want to go. She didn't know what this place was, what this man really wanted, but this home, this warmth, this silence, it was better than any life she had ever known. Later, while cleaning the room, she found something that made her stop. A mirror. It or he had been covered with a cloth and pushed behind a shelf. Maybe he had forgotten it. Maybe he'd hidden it for a reason. She didn't know. She pulled the cloth away slowly, and for the first time in years she looked at her reflection. She froze. The face staring back was a stranger. Her skin was pale and uneven, marked with old burns and long scars. One side of her face had a jagged line running from her temple to her chin. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes, once bright violet, now looked faded and empty. Her hair was still rough, though cleaner now. She looked like a creature from a nightmare. A monster. Her knees gave out, and she sat hard on the floor in front of the mirror. Her fingers touched her cheek, following the scars. Tears started to fall, silent and hot. No one had ever told her she was ugly. They didn't have to. They had sold her, ignored her, beaten her, and tossed her away like trash, like something less than alive. But now, staring at herself, she finally saw what they saw, what he must have seen when he bought her. Why did he help me? Her breath became shaky. Her tears wouldn't stop. She pressed her forehead to the wooden floor and whispered the words that burned in her throat. "I am nothing." The door creaked open behind her. She didn't look up. She didn't want him to see her like this. The human stepped into the room quietly. He looked at her, then at the uncovered mirror. She expected anger, disgust, maybe even pity. Instead, he walked over and knelt beside her. He placed something beside her on the floor, a folded cloth. Then softly he said, "You're not nothing." She shook her head, still hiding her face. "You see scars," he said, his voice low and steady. "I see survival." She didn't believe him. Couldn't. She lifted her head just enough to meet his eyes. They weren't full of shock or revulsion, just calm understanding. Like he had seen broken things before and still found value in them. "I was born with 2 working hands," he said suddenly, holding one up. "But I met someone once, an old soldier with only one. He used to say, missing pieces don't mean you're useless. They mean you fought and lived." He paused. "You've lived." She stared at him. No one had ever spoken to her. Like this. No one had ever made her believe her pain wasn't something to hide. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't deserve this." He looked at her gently. "You deserve rest. You deserve warmth. That's not a reward. That's your right." She wanted to say more, but she couldn't. Her heart felt too full, too heavy. She wiped her face and looked at the mirror again. The scars were still there, the bruises, the sharp bones under thin skin. But for the first time, she noticed something else too, her eyes. They weren't as empty now. There was a little light in them, a little strength. Maybe he was right. Maybe survival was a kind of beauty. She reached up and covered the mirror again. Not out of shame, but because she'd seen enough for today. She stood slowly, her knees still weak, and looked at the human. He didn't step away. He didn't tell her what to do. He just waited, and then for the first time she smiled. It was small, fragile, but it was real. He didn't smile back, but his eyes softened. "Dinner will be ready soon," he said quietly. She nodded, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by warmth, silence, and the scent of firewood, she felt something powerful stir inside her, not fear, not pain, but the beginning of something new. Hope. The days passed quietly. Each morning, the alien girl woke before the sun, folded her blanket neatly, and prepared a small corner of the house before the human stirred. She still hadn't told him her name. Maybe because she wasn't sure if she had one anymore. Maybe because she was scared that speaking it would bring the past back. But slowly her hands stopped shaking. Her eyes didn't dart with fear, and her footsteps, once silent like a hunted thing, began to carry weight. She had no reason to feel safe, but she did. She didn't understand it. Yet every time she looked at the human, something warm filled her chest. He had not given her pretty words or promises, but he had given her food, warmth, and silence that didn't hurt. One rainy afternoon, the skies were gray and heavy. The wind pushed at the windows and the trees groaned outside. The human brought in his tools, boots wet with mud. She had prepared tea again. Still, she never placed it in front of him. She always left it on the table quietly, before backing away. But this time he spoke. "Would you like to see something?" he asked, wiping his hands. She hesitated, unsure. He wasn't the kind of man who spoke much. She nodded slowly. He walked to a dusty shelf, pulled out a wooden box, and set it on the table. The box was small, carved with old shapes and vines. "Found it in the ruins near the ridge," he said. "It's broken, but I think I can fix it." Her curiosity pulled her closer, step by step. He opened the lid, revealing a little metal figure inside, a dancer with delicate wings, bent and faded. A music box. She had heard of them in stories other slaves whispered when guards weren't watching, but she'd never seen one. He turned the tiny handle. It made a weak clicking sound. The figure twitched but didn't move. No music came. He sighed, then smiled slightly. "Still not working," he muttered, "but I'll try again tomorrow." He began to close it, but she reached out without thinking. Her fingers brushed the edge of the box. "May I?" she asked, her voice soft as breath. He nodded. She opened it again. The figure's wings were chipped. Its paint was peeling. It reminded her of herself, broken, faded, still standing. She traced one wing gently, careful not to damage it more. Then she looked up at him and, for the first time, said, "It's beautiful." He didn't laugh at her. He didn't say, "It's useless." He simply said, "I thought so too." That night she couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about that little box. Something about it stayed with her. The way it tried to move even though it was broken. The way it held something delicate inside. The next morning, while sweeping, she found a small screw under the couch. She didn't recognize it, but she kept it. When the human returned from the field, she handed it to him silently. He blinked in surprise, took it, and held it up beside the music box. "Well," he said, smiling faintly, "you may have just saved our dancer." He worked on the box that evening. The girl watched from across the table. His hands were calm, focused. Her eyes followed every twist of the screwdriver, every click of the small gears. Time passed, but neither of them said much. Then finally he turned the key one more time. A soft tune played. It was not perfect. Some notes were missing and the gears whirred roughly. But the dancer turned, slowly, gracefully, its chipped wings glinting in the firelight. The girl's eyes widened. Her mouth opened in wonder. And then, it happened. She laughed. It was small, light, like the rustle of leaves. It slipped out before she could stop it. Her hands flew to her mouth in shock. She hadn't laughed in years, not since she was taken. Not since the chains and the cages. Not since her body became just another thing people owned. The human looked up. He didn't say anything, just watched her. Her face, usually still and afraid, now held something else. Something alive. She laughed again, a little louder this time. "She's dancing," she said, eyes wide with joy. "Even though she's broken, she's still dancing." The man smiled, more than he ever had before. That night, the music box sat on the shelf, and its tiny dancer kept turning slowly. The girl sat by the fire, knees to her chest, and stared into the flames. Her smile faded gently but never fully disappeared. She had laughed, really laughed, and the sound still echoed in her ears like a song she thought she'd never hear again. She didn't understand everything. She didn't know what this place truly meant. But she was starting to believe something impossible. Maybe life didn't have to be pain. Maybe being broken didn't mean being useless. And maybe, just maybe, someone like her could still feel happiness, even if only for a moment. The wind howled outside the small cabin like a beast searching for warmth. Rain hit the roof in wild waves and thunder rolled across the sky. Inside, the fire flickered low, casting soft orange light across the wooden floor. The girl sat quietly, near the flames, wrapped in her blanket, her fingers resting on the edge of the table. The human stood by the door, checking the latch. His face, as always, was calm, but tonight something about him felt heavy. She had started helping more, washing vegetables, sweeping, folding the blankets. She still flinched sometimes when things dropped loudly or when shadows moved too fast. But she had begun to breathe easier in this space. In this strange, quiet man's home, she had found something like peace. But tonight, everything felt different. He walked across the room, placed a worn satchel on the table, and began placing supplies into it. Dried fruit, tools, a folded blanket. Her heart tightened with each item. She didn't know why. Then finally, he looked at her. "You heard them outside yesterday, didn't you?" he asked softly. She nodded. She had. The voices, the harsh language, of slave hunters. They had passed through the woods not far from the house. She knew that kind of sound too well. Even now her hands trembled just remembering it. "I thought they wouldn't come this far," he continued, "but they're getting bolder. It's not safe for you here anymore." She stared at him, not blinking. He took a deep breath. "I made a path. It leads to the next town. You can follow the stream and stay hidden. No one will find you. There's a shelter there. A woman named Etta. Tell her I sent you. She'll keep you safe." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. He placed the satchel in front of her gently. "You don't have to go now. Wait until morning. But don't wait too long." She looked down at the bag. It was full. Everything she'd need to run, to hide, to survive. He had prepared it without asking anything in return. Without a word, she stood and walked to the window. The storm was wild. Trees shook like frightened animals. She could leave. She could be safe. But the thought of walking away from this cabin, this fire, this man, it made her feel something worse than fear. She turned toward him. "You're staying?" she asked in a whisper. He nodded. "They won't bother with me. I'm not what they want." "You could be hurt," he smiled, a small, tired smile. "I've survived worse." She stared at him, at his quiet strength, at the lines on his face, at the hands that had never hurt her, the hands that fixed broken things, fed her, protected her. He had given her a home when the galaxy called her trash. He had looked at her when no one else would, and now he was ready to lose her, to protect her again. Her legs moved before her thoughts caught up. She crossed the room slowly and stopped in front of him. She looked up into his eyes. "You don't want me to stay?" His brow furrowed. "That's not what this is about." "Then why are you sending me away?" "Because if they find you here, they'll take you again. Or worse. And I couldn't stand that." Her eyes filled with tears. "You bought me for 1 coin, but you never treated me like a slave. You gave me food, let me rest, made me laugh." Her voice trembled. "No one has ever done that. Not in my whole life." He said nothing. She reached up and placed her hand on his chest right over his heart. "This is the only place I've ever felt alive. Even if I die tomorrow, I don't want to run anymore." He looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "You don't understand what staying means. It's not safe. You'll always be looking over your shoulder. You'll never be completely free." She took a deep breath. "Freedom means nothing if I lose the one place I belong." He tried to speak, but her hand moved up, touched his cheek, softly like a whisper. "I choose this," she said, voice steady now. "I choose to stay." Outside, the storm grew louder. But inside, everything went still. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes told her he understood. He stepped forward and placed his hand gently over hers, still resting on his chest. For the first time, they stood close, not as a master and a slave, not as protector and rescued, but as 2 souls who had found something rare, a connection. She did not run that night. She sat beside him, near the fire, and listened to the storm together in silence. And in that silence, she knew. She had been sold, used, and cast away. But here, she had chosen her place. Not because she had to, but because her heart had finally whispered, "Stay." The storm had passed by morning. The forest outside was quiet, washed clean by rain. Birds chirped softly. The sky was pale blue, still heavy with leftover clouds. Inside the cabin, the fire had died down to soft glowing embers. The girl sat by it with a blanket around her shoulders, staring at the flickering light. She hadn't slept, not really. Not because she was afraid, but because her thoughts were too loud. She had chosen to stay. She had looked him in the eyes and said it out loud. It still didn't feel real. Her heart beat differently now, slower, but deeper. Not with fear, but with something heavier, warmer. The human was making tea again. His movements were calm, practiced. He didn't speak much. He never did. But his silence didn't feel cold like the others she'd known. It felt safe, like soft earth under bare feet. When he placed the tea in front of her, he paused for a second, like he wanted to say something. She met his eyes, then lowered, hers quickly, unsure. Her body had learned to fear closeness. Even after weeks in his care, a part of her still flinched at shadows or sudden movement. But last night had changed something. She had stayed, and he hadn't touched her or spoken a single word that made her feel small. That silence had been the loudest kindness. After breakfast, she stepped outside. The wet ground squished softly under her bare feet. The air smelled of wood and moss. She stood still, arms crossed, looking at the stream that ran nearby. The sound of it was peaceful. She watched the water for a long time. When she turned around, he was standing on the porch, watching her too. Not with hunger or control, but like someone seeing another person for who they truly were. His eyes didn't scan her like a thing. They simply rested on her face and waited. She walked back slowly. As she reached the steps, she paused. Her fingers curled tightly into the blanket. "Can I ask something?" she whispered. He nodded once. "Why haven't you hurt me?" Her voice shook, his brow furrowed. "Because I never wanted to." "But you bought me," she said softly. "I didn't buy you," he replied after a long pause. "I freed you. No one should live in a cage." She blinked. That word, freed, felt strange in her ears. She stepped up onto the porch, close enough to hear his breath. "You never touched me," she said. "Not once. Not when I was weak. Not when I cried." "I wanted you to heal," he answered. "Not to fear." She looked down at her arms. The bruises were fading. Her skin was still scarred, but the wounds had closed. The pain was still inside, but now it had space to breathe. "Can I try something?" she asked, unsure what she was even requesting. He looked surprised, but he nodded. She reached out, slowly, carefully, like a child touching fire. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. She paused just before it reached his chest, waiting for some invisible permission. He didn't move, didn't speak, just let her choose. Her palm rested flat, against his chest, over his heart. He was warm, real. She held it there for a few seconds, then placed her other hand on top. Her breathing became uneven. Tears formed in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. "This is the first time I touched someone," she whispered. "And I wasn't afraid." He reached up slowly, letting her see every motion. Then gently, so gently, he placed his hand over hers. No force, no demand, just warmth. She let out a shaky breath. Her shoulders relaxed. Her fingers curled lightly against his chest. She looked up at him, eyes shining. "It doesn't hurt." "No," he said. "It shouldn't." She stepped closer, letting her head rest gently against him. Her cheek pressed to his chest, where his heartbeat was steady, slow, real. He didn't pull away. He didn't freeze. His arms came around her like a shield, not to hold her down, but to hold her up. They stood like that for a long time. No one spoke. No one had to. She wasn't a slave anymore. Not in body, not in spirit. And in that one embrace, a soft touch, with no pain, no fear, she felt something shatter inside her. Not her heart, not her trust, but the chains that had lived in her mind for so long. She pulled back slightly, looked up at him, and smiled. A real smile. "You taught me something," she said. "What's that?" he asked. "That not all touches are made to hurt," she whispered. "Some are made to heal." And for the first time, she believed it. The sky turned golden that evening. Light poured through the wooden cabin windows like warm honey, touching every corner with soft peace. The girl stood by the window, watching the sun sink behind the trees. Her reflection looked back at her, in the glass, not as a slave, not as something broken, but as someone whole. Her clothes were clean now. Her skin, though still marked with scars, glowed with life. Her hair had grown just a little, no longer ragged and wild. She didn't hide her face anymore. She didn't lower her eyes. Something had changed inside. Something had stayed. Behind her, the human man stirred a pot gently on the stove. The room smelled of herbs and stew. It was a small thing, but to her it was everything. A meal she didn't have to beg for. A home where the silence wasn't cruel. A man who never raised his hand. Never looked at her with ownership in his eyes. He looked at her like a person. Like someone who mattered. Like someone he trusted. She turned toward him slowly and stepped closer, barefoot on the wooden floor. He glanced up, and their eyes met. No words were spoken for a moment. Just a shared stillness that held more than any sentence ever could. "I used to think love was fake," she said softly. Just a word masters used when they wanted to hurt you slower. His stirring stopped. He didn't interrupt. But with you, she continued, I've learned that love is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It waits. It listens. He looked at her gently. You don't owe me anything, he said, just as he had before. She stepped even closer. I know, but I want to give you something. He raised an eyebrow slightly, curious but calm. She took his hand in hers slowly. You gave me your home, your warmth, your silence. She smiled faintly. Let me give you something in return. Opened his mouth to speak, but she gently placed her finger on his lips. Let me finish, she whispered. Her voice shook, but her eyes were steady now. I want to stay, not because I'm afraid, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because when I'm with you I feel like I was never meant to be a slave, like I can become something more. He looked down at her hands wrapped around his. You've always been more, he said, even when no one else saw it. A tear slid down her cheek, but she was smiling. She led him to the fire and sat beside him, just as she had on so many quiet nights before. But tonight, she didn't keep space between them. She leaned her head on his shoulder and he didn't move away. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the walls. For the first time, her heart wasn't full of fear. It was full of choice. I want to share your bed, she whispered, not as a slave's offering but as a woman's vow. Not for warmth, not for safety, but because I want to belong beside you. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked, into her eyes where something deep and glowing now lived. Not sadness, not even gratitude, but a promise. I won't ask anything from you, he said gently. You know, that I do, she replied. That's why I want to give everything. The words weren't rushed. There was no hunger, no pressure. Just two people who had walked through pain, who had learned that healing didn't come with time but with trust. That night, she climbed into his bed with trembling hands and a calm heart. He pulled the blanket over both of them. They lay side by side facing each other, and she pressed her forehead to his chest. His arms held her, not like property but like something precious. She had once been tossed in a cage, sold for a coin, and called ugly, worthless, broken. But now she was held like a gift, like a miracle. His breath was steady. Her fingers curled lightly into the fabric of his shirt, and in that quiet, in that stillness, she whispered a final truth. Soft, sacred, and real. You saw me when no one else did. You gave me a name without asking. Now let me be yours, forever. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. The stars blinked to life, as if they too had been waiting for this moment. And in the heart of a quiet cabin, once a prison for silence, now a home for love, a girl who had known nothing but chains and a man who had asked for nothing but peace, finally found what neither had ever dared to hope for: belonging.